Chapter 21, Part 2 of J.S. Bach, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. J.S. Bach, Volume 2, by Albert Schweitzer, translated by Ernest Newman. Chapter 21, Part 2. Word and Tone in Bach, continued. His conception of the Bible words is not always the customary one. It comes from a profound and very personal emotion. The music he has given to the sacramental words of the Last Supper in the St. Matthew Passion is astounding. There's not a trace of grief. The music breathes peace and majesty. The nearer it draws to the end, the more stately becomes the quaver movement in the basses. Bach sees Jesus standing before the disciples with radiant face, prophesying of the day when he will again drink from the cup at the heavenly supper with them in his Father's kingdom. Bach has thus emancipated himself from the conventional idea of the scene, and by means of his artistic intuition has attained a juster sense of it than theology has ever done. The commencement of the recitative of the Passion, Aber am ersten Tage der süßen Brote, now the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, is notably bright, almost joyous. So is the chorus of disciples, Wo willst du, dass wir dir bereiten das Osterlamm zu essen? Where wilt thou, that we prepare for thee to eat the Passion? Bach continues in this ingenuous and somewhat joyous mood until Jesus utters the Wahrlich, ich sage euch, einer unter euch wird mich verraten. Verily, I say unto you that one of you shall betray me. The Wahrlich, du bist auch einer von denen, denn deine Sprache verrät dich. Surely thou also art one of them, for thy speech betrayeth thee. In the second part of the work is very briefly treated, without a suspicion of passion. It is simply a passing remark of the soldiers, again a fine stroke of the imagination. Everywhere, in fact, there is the same profound view and the same characteristic expression of the emotions and actions. Moreover, Bach now and then heightens the sentiment of his text in the most striking way. He turns contentment into exultant joy and grief into violent despair. Not that he neglects the nuances of feeling, even in thus intensifying it. His music expresses many degrees of joy and of sorrow, but all of them are surcharged with emotion. When he translates a feeling into tone, he voices it in its extreme form. In the first chorus of the cantata, Ach, lieben Christen, seid getrost, number 114, he expresses the getrost in terms of such overflowing joy that the music goes far beyond the text. There is the same joyous excitement in the resignation expressed in the first chorus of the cantata, Was mein Gott will, das geschehe allzeit, number 111. It is the same with the organ chorales. What the chorale preludes, Mit Fried und Freud fahr ich dahin, Peters 5, number 41, and Wer nur den lieben Gott lässt walten, Peters 5, 54, express is joy of an animated kind, not the peaceful confidence of which the text speaks. Bach is thus bent on making the music characteristically expressive at any cost. Before he decides simply to write beautiful music to a text, he searches the words through and through to find an emotion, which after it has been intensified is suitable for musical representation. He remodels his text to suit the way he means to express it in music. The words are finally no more than a shadow picture of the music. Bach's relation to his text is active, not passive. It does not inspire him so much as he inspires it. His music lifts the words to a higher power, bringing out in transfigured form what seems struggling for expression in the mediocrity, or as often enough happens, the banality of the poem. For this reason there are hardly any tasteless Bach texts for anyone who reads through his works. He even becomes a little impatient at the constant complaints about the cantata poems, for he hears them with all the poetry Bach has added to them, a poetry besides which that of the original poet is only a clumsy reflection. Footnote: it is of course not denied that a remodeling of the text is imperatively called for now and then, to give without alteration the recitative O Sünder trage mit Geduld from the cantata Ach, lieben Christen, seid getrost, number 114, which contains a dissertation on the dropsy of sin, would be doing Bach a disservice. Translations into foreign languages should be quite free, aiming only at giving the text that Bach has expressed in his music, i.e., the ideal text. This principle has been followed in the French versions, published by Breitkopf and Hertel. Gustav Brett's translation of Sie werden aus Saba alle kommen is a masterpiece of this kind. End of footnote. We are appalled at the triteness of such words as those of the alto aria in the cantata Ach, lieben Christen, seid getrost, number 114. Quote, Du machst, o Tod, mir nun nicht ferne Bange, wenn ich durch dich die Freiheit nur erlange. Es muss ja so einmal gestorben sein. End quote. When, however, we hear them with the music, they express most eloquently the blissful joy of the redeemed soul, in which the painful word gestorben, dead, only appears in order to be triumphed over. The addition of Es muss ja so einmal gestorben sein has given Bach a pretext for transforming the text into a poem of death and transfiguration. Hundreds of examples of the same kind could be given. We get the impression that the composer is even indifferent to the actual words of his text and their banalities, not merely because they have the same savor for him as for his contemporaries, but because he's conscious how little really remains of the words when he's poured his own poetic power upon them. It was a similar consciousness of strength that made him burden himself with the contemporary Italian form of the da capo aria. He was secretly aware that his musical declamation could vivify even a mere pattern of this kind. There is a great difference between the respective attitudes of Bach and Mozart towards a poor text. Both of them make us forget it by their music, but for quite different reasons. Mozart's object is to distract our minds from the text by means of music that is beautiful in itself. Bach gives it a new profundity and a new form in his music. How does he handle his music when the poem presents a series of points for expression? To what extent does he attempt to reproduce these successions of ideas in tone? He does not try to do so. Many cases can indeed be pointed to in his works, where the music scrupulously follows every verbal detail of the poem. In the cantata Nun komm der Heiden Heiland, number 61, for example, the line Das sich wundert alle Welt has an animation that makes it stand out sharply from the remainder. But in all these cases it is not so much a matter of an independent musical reproduction of the changing ideas of the text, as of underlining isolated and salient lines and words. Bach does not follow his text line by line, no matter how tempting the episodes it presents. He expresses the characteristic emotional content, the word that seems to him vital for the mood of the whole, in an eloquent melodic motif. He is sure that in so doing he has expressed the poem itself. Whether we're reading a chorale prelude from the Orgelbewegung or a large chorus from one of the cantatas, it's all the same. Almost invariably the motif that appears in the first bar is maintained to the last, as if the composer were indifferent to the details of the text. If the orchestra, for example, has broken into an exuberant motif of joy, it will not give it up, even though the poem should afterwards express feelings of another kind. If there comes some specially characteristic word, it is thrown into harmonic relief. The first chorus of the cantata, Mache dich, mein Geist, bereit, wache, fleh und bete, number 115, is dominated like that of Wachet auf, number 140, by a soaring, animated motive that symbolizes the wachen, waking. The music will not be turned from its course by the concept of beten, to pray. All Bach does is to bring this home to us by a striking modulation. In the chorale fantasias, again, the shadows of certain words seem to pass occasionally over the music. On the whole, we can say that Bach only takes into account in his music the most salient episodes of the text, confining himself mainly to expressing the basic mood of it. Often this seems to him to reside in some contrast, which he will suggest by a conflict of two characteristic motifs. The classical example of this is the introductory chorus of the cantata Ihr werdet weinen und heulen, aber die Welt wird sich freuen, number 103. His fondness for sharp contrasts makes him particularly delight in texts of this kind. Even when the antithesis suggested in the poem is purely incidental, he will fasten upon it and make it the fundamental idea of his music. In the Capriccio on the departure of his brother, Bach entered upon the path that leads to program music. It was not, however, the naive program music of a Kuhnau, who undertook to tell whole histories in music, but an art fully conscious of the limits of what can be intelligibly expressed in tone, and confining itself to a sequence of a few plastic scenes admirably characterized in the music. Bach's experience in this youthful experiment led him afterwards to aim at expression on other lines. His artistic greatness is shown in the fact that in an epoch of confident and pretentious program music, he rises superior to it from the beginning, and never aims at trying to express in music what music is incapable of expressing. The naive program musicians of the past and the present are like the biblical painters, who, relying on the fact that every detail of certain of the sacred stories is known, deluded themselves that they had really represented those scenes when they had accumulated the various objects and persons concerned on their canvas, while all the time they had failed to make the real thing, the event itself, comprehensible. A man with a knife, a boy bound to a pile of wood, a ram's head in a bush, a bearded face looking down from the clouds, this, they thought, was the sacrifice of Isaac. A man and a woman at a well, in the background a town, on the road leading to it 12 men scattered about, here and there in pairs. This was supposed to tell the story of Jesus and the woman of Samaria. The real action is added by the spectator out of the convention that resolves a simultaneous grouping of the figures on the canvas into a succession in time. As a rule, very few of the biblical stories are really paintable, in the true sense of the word, for the event does not present a single pregnant situation which contains and elucidates the whole action. Thus the majority of biblical painters, by having to presuppose so much knowledge of the subject on the spectator's part, have given us not pictures but illustrations that exceed the limits of true painting to the same extent that descriptive program music exceeds those of true music. Bach, however, did not let the general knowledge of the chorales and biblical texts mislead him into an attempt to depict in his music all the details and salient episodes of his text. He keeps within the real possibilities of musical expression, even in cases where another man would think it safe to rely on the general knowledge of the words to carry off his strokes of pictorialism. He thus makes no effort to represent all the episodes and evolutions of the text. He expresses the essential elements in the idea, not its vicissitudes. He underlines, indeed, any characteristic detail, brings out contrasts, employs the most powerful nuances, but the vicissitudes of the idea, its struggles, its combats, its despair, its entry into peace, all that Beethoven's music and that of the post-Beethoven epoch try to express, of this there is nothing in Bach. Nevertheless, his emotional expression is not less perfect than Beethoven's. It is simply another kind of perfection. His emotional utterance has a power and an impressiveness such as we rarely meet with in other music. His capacity for characterizing the various nuances of an emotion is quite unique. Thus Bach's music is also emotional music in the truest and deepest sense, though he pursues a path far remote from that of Wagner. Both composers aim at realizing poetic ideas in music. Both avoid program music, that is, a naive translation of the poem into sound. Both remain strictly within the real possibilities of musical expression. But they are different in this respect, that Bach depicts the idea in its static, Wagner in its dynamic life. There is no art to which Wagner's definition of the nature of music is less applicable than that of Bach. According to Wagner, the harmonic changes must be inevitable in the sense that they are motivated by the poetry and express an emotion that demands the intensifying power of music. This is not the case with Bach's modulations. Generally speaking, they are of a purely musical nature. They, too, are inevitable, but in the sense that they are a logical unfolding of what was latent in the theme from the beginning. So far, those are right who meet all modernizations of Bach, good and bad, with the objection that his art is, quote, pure music, unquote. In this way they express, even if obscurely, the truth that unlike Beethoven and Wagner, he does not represent an emotion as a series of dramatic incidents. The perception of this distinction is of the first importance for the performance of Bach's music. It makes us realize the error of imposing upon Bach the Beethovenian and Wagnerian dynamics, the purpose of which is to heighten the harmonic expression of the various poetic incidents. Bach's music is of a different order. Beethoven and Wagner poetize in music, Bach paints. And Bach is a dramatist, but just in the sense that the painter is. He does not paint successive events, but seizes upon the pregnant moment that contains the whole event for him, and depicts this in music. That is why the opera had so little attraction for him. He knew the Hamburg stage from his youth. He was intimate with the leading people at the Dresden theatre. If nevertheless he never wrote an opera, it was not because the external circumstances were unfavorable, but because, unlike Wagner, he did not conceive action and music in one. The musical drama is for him a succession of dramatic pictures. He realizes it in his passions and cantatas. In Bach, the poetic idea is embedded in the theme. This is not, as in Wagner, a melodic determination of a certain harmony welling up out of the depths of the ocean of tone. It is more akin in origin to the thematic invention of Berlioz. It resembles the latter's themes in its emotional vehemence and a certain pictorial tendency, for it is the product of the same kind of plastic imagination. Bach's view of tone painting is different from Wagner's. For the latter, self-existent tone painting is only a makeshift. His ideal is that music shall address itself, as in drama, to feeling rather than imagination. Bach, on the other hand, appeals to the conceptual imagination. Tone painting is an end in itself with him. The ideal before him is not the self-expression of this pictorialism, but the carrying of it to the extremest limits of realism. The first thing he looks for in a text is the image or idea that gives an opportunity for a definitely plastic musical expression. This image may lie at the very root of the thought, or it may be a mere incident in the text. In either case, it is for Bach the essential element in the words, and he works it out without troubling whether by so doing he's really expressing or not the emotional content of the poem. His idea of a good poet is one who gives the maximum of images that are translatable into sound. We sometimes wonder that he did not weary of the doggerel of Picander, his chief librettist. When, however, we consider the plastic variety of these libretti, we can see at once what attracted Bach to them time after time, nor does he object to his librettist giving him the same pictures again and again. On the contrary, he reproduces them in tone with ever new delight. We really get the impression that he demanded pictorial opportunities of this kind. He even forgives his librettist when he adds extraneous pictures of his own to the classical text of a choral strophe. Footnote. See, for example, the second verse of the choral cantata Ich hab in Gottes Herz und Sinn, number 92. End of footnote. In the St. John Passion, he cannot dispense with the rending of the curtain and the earthquake at the death of Jesus. He inserts these events in his text, although they do not occur in the fourth Gospel. The difference between Wagner and Bach becomes most evident in their conceptions of natural events. Wagner conceives nature through his emotions, Bach, in this respect like Berlioz, through his imagination. Bach is not satisfied until he's sure that the hearer actually sees the dust of the whirlwind, the clouds scudding across the sky, the falling leaves, the raging waves. When his poets came to the end of their tether, all they had to do was to bring nature on the scene. They could be sure of satisfying him in this way. This is the explanation of the fact that the secular cantatas are veritable nature poems. Footnote. In the French translation, the secular cantata Weichet nur, betrübte Schatten has been justly called the spring cantata. End of footnote. The great thing, however, is that this nature painting is always musical. Abt Vogler, the other great master whom Weber placed by the side of Bach, also aimed at tone painting, but found that though it was very successful with the people, the musicians looked askance at him for it. Quote, "They complained," he says, "that I tried to represent on the all-powerful instrument, the organ, natural phenomena such as thunder, earthquakes, collapsing walls, etc." End quote. From Choralsystem, 1800, page 102. And he tells us how he succeeded in the village church at Uppsala, not only with crying children and howling dogs, but in making a deaf-mute feel the thunder. Bach certainly could not cite such testimonies for his painting. However realistic it is, it always keeps within the limits of musical symbolism. Here again the whole expression lies in the theme. It is this that stimulates the conceptual imagination of the hearer. His tone painting is never obtrusive. It lasts as long as the occasion that called it forth, but not a moment longer. This perfect moderation, in spite of the great vivacity of the tone painting, becomes all the more astonishing when we examine his recitative accompaniments. In the St. Matthew Passion, he gives the most drastic musical expression to every characteristic word in the account of the Passion, but it never delays the story for a moment. The tone painting merely heightens the plastic impression of the words. A typical example of Bach's method may be seen in the first aria of the cantata, "Siehe, ich will viel Fischer aussenden," number 88. The words are taken from Jeremiah 16:16. Quote, "Behold, I will send for many fishers, saith the Lord, and they shall fish them, and after will I send for many hunters, and they shall hunt them." End quote. In the first part, the strings paint the rolling waves of a lake. The second part is filled with clashing fanfares in the wind instruments. At times, Bach will paint in a single passage several characteristic words in succession. It is an interesting psychological observation that in the Bach family the gift for painting went along with that for music. Samuel Anton Bach, who came of the Meiningen stock and who studied with Johann Sebastian at the beginning of the 30s, was not only a capable organist but an eminent portrait painter in pastel, and his double gift was inherited by his descendants. Footnote. For further information about these pastel painters of the Meiningen branch of the family, see Wolfram, J.S. Bach, pages 13 and 14. End of footnote. Johann Sebastian's grandchild, the son of Philipp Emanuel, gave up music and to his father's horror became a painter. The idea that prompted Bach to paint a musical picture is not always equally clear to us. It often takes us some time to discover how he's realized his text in music. But when once we have grasped the sense of the music, it seems unthinkable that the poem could be depicted from any other standpoint. Daring as his painting often is, the final and enduring impression is one of absolute satisfaction, and this is the fundamental proof of the veracity of his art. Not only the avowed picture, but every characteristic movement is regarded pictorially by Bach. Expressions like erwachen, awake, auffahren, ascend, auferstehen, arise, steigen, mount, emporschwingen, soar, eilen, hasten, straucheln, stumble, wanken, stagger, sinken, fall. Wherever they occur, furnish the germ idea of the theme. It is noteworthy, however, that Bach's imagination also conceives motion when it is not actually expressed in the text, but only implied. A number of the most striking themes and motives that otherwise would be quite incomprehensible are explained in this way. What is the meaning, for example, of the accompaniment of the Arioso of the St. Matthew Passion? Ja, freilich will in uns das Fleisch und Blut zum Kreuz gezwungen sein. Aye, surely now can flesh and blood atone, if the cross hold them bound, unquote, with its curious flickering flute accompaniment and its abstruse conclusion. The preceding recitative has told us that Simon of Cyrene has been given the cross of Jesus to carry. Bach sees Jesus laboring under the cross, stumbling along, sinking on his knees and breaking down. He paints this picture of him in the accompaniment, while the Arioso comments upon the scene. The conductor, who's grasped the meaning of this recitative, will not let his flutists group their three notes in the usual sentimental diminuendo, but will make them give a heavy emphasis each time to the third note, and preserve this accentuation to the end, without a rallentando or diminuendo. In this way, the simple motive, without the necessity for any further explanation, will conjure up before the imagination of the hearer the picture of Christ staggering under the burden of the cross. Another example of Bach's representation of movement is to be seen in the first chorus of the cantata, Brich dem Hungrigen dein Brot, number 39. The text runs thus, Is it not to deal thy bread to the hungry, and that thou bring the poor that are cast out to thy house? When thou seest the naked, that thou cover him, and that thou hide not thyself from thine own flesh? Isaiah 63:7. The music seems at first curiously disjointed. Spitta, in J.S. Bach 382, surmises that it is prompted by the conception of the breaking of bread. He feels bound, indeed, to add a saving clause. How far, he says, Bach is from mere triviality is seen in the sequel, where the same accompaniment continues to quite other words. It simply gives the passage a peculiarly delicate and pliant character. It was this that Bach was chiefly aiming at. Here, both the explanation of the tone painting and the excuse for it are wrong. The excuse, because we could not reproach Bach with anything worse than retaining a picture in his music after the necessity for it in the text had gone by. The explanation, because no one who listens to the music can take it to be a picture of the breaking of bread. What then is the meaning of it? The monotonous instrumental accompaniment with the regular crotchets in the bass has more the character of a march. A certain unrest enters with the vocal parts. It's as if we heard uncertain, tottering steps defiling past us. One of the chief themes runs thus. The music thus depicts the wretched ones who are being supported and led into the house. As soon as the words "Führe in das Haus" have been uttered, the picture ceases in the accompaniment, which is now constructed of other themes. In the cantata, Es ist ein trotzig und verzagtes Ding, number 176, Spitta is horror-struck at the gavotte-like character of the first aria. As a piece of music, he says, it's perfectly charming, but it does not agree at all with the text, which speaks of the timidity of the Christian before Jesus, the God-possessed and wonder-working. If the condition of the autograph did not forbid it, the worthy biographer of Bach would like to believe that the music has been taken from some other cantata, and has nothing whatever in common with this text. All we can do, he concludes, is simply to point out the discrepancy. The discord between the text and the music disappears as soon as we realize that Bach had the idea of movement here. The words run thus, quote, "When I inquire after the Master, thy, i.e. the sun's, beloved light shall be clouded, for I am afraid by day." End quote. The situation is explained by the preceding recitative in which Nicodemus waits for the sun to set in order to go to Jesus. In the aria, he is on his way to him. In the following recitative, he is with him. The aria thus represents him, soliloquizing as he walks delicately and circumspectly, but joyously, in the twilight. The rhythm that runs through the movement is really the only characteristic thing in the text that music can fasten upon. Here the music in no way aims at expressing pure feeling. Examples of this kind show that when we are studying Bach, the seemingly shortest and most direct way from the text to the music is not always the right one. To discover his real thought, we must very often follow him along the bypaths that surround his idea, which is strongly pictorial in essence. His music is very often a picture of a situation. Allied with this pictorial instinct is the plastic symbolism which Bach's music confers on abstract thoughts. In the first chorus of the cantata, Du sollst Gott deinem Herrn lieben von ganzem Herzen, number 77, he ventures to elucidate the saying of Jesus that the whole law is contained in the commandment of love. He builds up the chorus on the cantus firmus of the chorale, Dies sind die heiligen 10 Gebot, bringing it in the basses in augmentation and in the trumpets in diminution. Further, in order to add to the great and small commandments the very smallest, the titles of the law of which Jesus speaks in the Sermon on the Mount, the chorus and orchestra have in addition a motif derived from the first notes of the melody. This movement is typical of very many other pieces of symbolism in his work, equally daring, and yet fundamentally musical in conception. He does not even shrink from finding a musical symbol for the abstract idea of time. In the cantata on the chorale, quote, "Wer weiß, wie nahe mir mein Ende, hin geht die Zeit, her kommt der Tod." End quote. Number 27. The flight of time is suggested in the orchestra by a mysterious pendulum stroke that never ceases throughout the opening chorus. There is a similar representation in the first chorus of the cantata, Alles nur nach Gottes Willen, number 72. Bach's music is thus pictorial to the extent that wherever possible his themes and motifs are conditioned by a pictorial association of ideas, whether this can be found directly or indirectly in the text, and whether it is a salient feature of it or not. There are motifs the pictorial origin of which we should not recognize at first sight, if the key to them were not afforded by others of the same kind. If we arrange the themes and the motifs of the chorale fantasias, cantatas, and passions according to their formal affinities and their congruence with the text, we see that whenever Bach has to find music for analogous ideas, a whole group of pictorial associations of ideas comes forward, as if in obedience to an inner law. End of chapter 21, part 2, read by Sandra, near Montreal, 2021.